Hey guys, tonight we dive gently into a world where every meal feels like a gamble. You find yourself trudging through a misty medieval village, the chill biting your cheeks as dawn creeps over the thatched roofs. The scent of damp earth and smoky hearths fills the air, and your stomach rumbles softly, reminding you that food is never far from your mind here. You probably won't survive a day in this place without mastering the art of stretching every crumb. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time below. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake as the village stirs the wooden shutters, creaking open, the faint murmur of farmers and children stirring through the crisp morning air. Hunger isn't just a passing thought, it's the quiet companion that shadows every moment. For medieval peasants, life was a cycle centered around the seasons, the weather, and most importantly, what the land could grudgingly offer. Unlike your modern-day pantry stuffed with colorful options, their cupboards held little variety. More often than not, their staple was simple and unadorned rye bread, a dense, dark loaf that felt like chewing on the very soil itself. Wheat bread, lighter and fluffier, was mostly a luxury reserved for the wealthy, or on special occasions, while peasants made do with coarser grains that could survive harsher soils. Your typical day begins with a bowl of pottage, a watery stew made from whatever vegetables were available, sometimes thickened with grains or peas. Meat was a rare luxury, perhaps enjoyed once or twice a year, if lucky often reserved for festivals or the occasional hunt. The pottage simmered over the fire all day, its bland aroma a constant presence. Historians generally agree that this humble stew was the backbone of peasant diets, though there's debate about exactly how often it included protein. Some argue that legumes played a larger role, while others suspect peasants relied heavily on foraged plants and grains. You might imagine hunger as a sudden pang, but for peasants it was more like a dull, persistent ache, a state of being, rather than a temporary discomfort. Oddly, this constant hunger shaped not just their meals, but their entire lifestyle. You wake knowing you'll have to make do, savoring the warmth of your little hearth and the smell of rye baking slowly, before the day's work drags you into the fields. And here's a quirky tidbit. Did you know that in some regions peasants chewed on bark or roots as a last resort? It sounds unpleasant, and it probably was, but it helped stave off starvation enough to get through the hardest seasons. Historians still argue whether these survival tactics were widespread or isolated, but they offer a glimpse into the sheer resourcefulness born of necessity. So, as you settle in, imagine biting into that dense rye loaf, feeling the rough texture on your tongue, and listening to the crackle of the fire, knowing this is your first and possibly only meal of the day. You're stepping into a rhythm older than most cities where hunger was never far, but survival depended on adapting quietly to the land's limits. You turn your thoughts now to rye bread, the humble hero of peasant sustenance. Unlike the soft golden wheat loaves favored by nobles and royalty, rye was the grain of the common folk, hardy and tough enough to grow in poorer soils and colder climates. You watch as a peasant woman kneads the dense dough rough hands, working steadily by the flickering light of a smoky hearth. This bread isn't meant to delight your taste buds, it's meant to fill your belly and keep you going. The crust is hard enough to chip a tooth, but that's just part of the experience. Rye bread was not just a staple, it was survival. It stored well and could be baked in communal ovens, making it a practical choice for villages. Wheat, on the other hand, was reserved for special occasions, religious festivals, or the Lord's table, and its lighter texture was prized as a symbol of status. Your ancestors might have joked about the poor man's bread, but you understand that for peasants it was much more, sometimes the only bread they'd see for weeks. Interestingly, rye bread was often mixed with other grains, including barley or oats, to stretch supplies even further. You might imagine medieval loaves being uniform and neat, but in reality they were irregular dense lumps, sometimes coarse, enough to need soaking in ale or broth to soften before eating. You're probably grateful you don't have to dunk your bread in small beer just to swallow it easily. Here's a quirky fact. In some regions, peasants baked rye bread using ash-covered ovens, which gave the crust a distinctive smoky flavor, if you could call it flavor. Not quite artisan baking as we know it today, but definitely rustic. And speaking of ashes, historians still argue whether peasants ever intentionally added wood ash to their dough to improve texture or leavening. Some say it was accidental, others think it was an early baking trick. You can almost smell the faintly sour scent of rye fermenting in the dark, damp granaries. The bread's dense nature made it a dependable companion through long days of back-breaking work, especially when paired with watery pottage or occasionally foraged greens. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough to keep you marching through the fields. So next time you bite into a soft sandwich, remember this medieval peasants chewed through bread that could double as a doorstop. Not the most romantic image, but it surely earned its place in history, fueling generations with grit and quiet determination. You wake with the dawn hands already itching to work the fields, but your stomach protests quietly, a low reminder that food is scarce and precious. Today your meal plan revolves around pottage, the peasant's trusty companion. Imagine a bubbling pot over an open fire filled with whatever vegetables, grains, or scraps you could find or afford. It's more broth than stew, thin and earthy, simmering slowly while you toil. Pottage was the backbone of medieval diets, a stew so basic it could be made from turnips, onions, cabbage peas, or barley. The recipe was simple: toss in what you have, add water, and let it cook for hours. Meat, if it appeared at all, was a rare guest, often a leftover bone or a scrap from the Lord's table. Instead, peasants relied heavily on grains and legumes to fill out the pot. You might find it a bit bland, but in a world without spice racks or refrigerators, it was a reliable source of nutrition. You might find it amusing that some peasants flavor-enhanced their pottage with what we'd now consider unusual ingredients: nettles, dandelion leaves, or even ground acorns. These wild plants gave a surprising kick to the otherwise plain dish. Oddly enough, this was both a matter of flavor and survival. When crops failed, foraging was essential. Historians still argue whether pottage was a constant in daily diets or more of a seasonal fallback. Some suggest that in better years, peasants enjoyed more variety, but during tough times, pottage was the meal that kept them going day after day, year after year. You notice how the steam rising from the pot carries the faint aroma of earth and rain-dampened leaves, comforting in its simplicity. Imagine dipping a piece of that tough rye bread into the thin broth, soaking it just enough to soften before biting down. The chewiness of the bread and the watery stew mix in your mouth, a humble symphony of survival, In a curious twist, some peasant communities believed that eating nettles was good for their blood, a kind of folk medicine passed down through generations. So not only did pottage feed your hunger, but it might have given you a little medicinal boost as well. You're not entirely sure if that helped, but it's a comforting thought as you trudge back to the fields full enough to keep working. You move through the village marketplace, the faint clatter of wooden carts and the murmur of bargaining voices filling the air. For a medieval peasant, the market was a rare event, a chance to trade produce or handmade goods for something new, or maybe just a break from the endless grind. But food was always the main concern, especially in lean times. You're curious how these tiny hubs of exchange helped peasants overcome hunger. Markets brought together farmers, bakers, and traders, offering a patchwork of foodstuffs that could add variety to otherwise monotonous diets. Imagine sniffing the air, catching hints of smoked fish, freshly ground herbs, or a rare sweet treat. You might spot a trader selling salted herring, cheap filling, and a godsend for those far from the sea. Salted fish was not only tasty, but an important source of protein stored without refrigeration for months. The lively chatter hides an undercurrent of economic tension, though. You realize that many peasants had little coin to spend relying on barter or small trades like eggs, wool, or vegetables. Some historians still argue how much actual food changed hands versus goods or favors, especially when local lords controlled much of the land and wealth. One quirky market habit was the use of token coins or tally sticks, pieces of wood marked with notches to record debts or trades. This system was both simple and effective, keeping track without the need for minted coins, which were scarce for peasants. Imagine the tactile feel of that stick in your hand, a quiet reminder of debts and exchanges, much like today's credit cards, but less plastic and a lot more rustic. Markets were also social occasions, occasions to exchange news, gossip, and even small amusements like juggling or singing. It wasn't just about food. It was a vital part of village life that sustained the spirit as much as the body. As you walk away with a small bag of salted fish and some dried herbs, you appreciate the subtle ways these communal gatherings helped stave off hunger, weaving a fragile safety net in times of uncertainty. The market's chaos seems less harsh now, more like a steady heartbeat beneath the hard edges of peasant life. You wake before dawn again, the air crisp with morning chill, and head to the fields where the backbone of peasant survival is silently growing grains. Wheat, barley, rye, and oats, each with its own story and stubbornness against weather and pests. For medieval peasants, grains weren't just food. They were currency, a lifeline, and a form of insurance against hunger. Picture yourself bending over a patch of rye fingers, gently pulling ears heavy with seeds. Rye was a tough customer, able to thrive in poorer soils where wheat might give up the fight. It was the bread of the poor, dark and dense but filling. Barley was often brewed into ale, another staple that quenched thirst and filled stomachs after hard labor. Historians still debate how often peasants actually drank ale, considering its safer water content compared to sometimes murky wells. One quirky survival trick involved turning grains into gruels or porridge, simple mushy meals that stretched a handful of grain to feed many. You might find it surprising that in some regions, adding a bit of leftover beer or fermented whey to the porridge improved flavor and digestion. Not exactly gourmet, but it worked. You may have heard that Medieval peasants were always hungry or malnourished, but the reality is more nuanced. Grain cultivation required knowledge passed down through generations: when to sow, when to harvest, how to store the harvest safely from vermin. Grain storage was a constant concern. A breached granary could mean disaster. Villages had communal granaries, but there was always the lurking threat of theft or spoilage. In some cases, they even used cats and dogs as grain protectors, an early form of pest control that might make you smile. Interestingly, some medieval laws regulated grain prices and storage, showing the importance of these staples to community survival. These regulations sometimes sparked disputes, making bread both a comfort and a political tool. You can imagine villagers grumbling quietly about the Lord's fair prices while silently hoarding just enough for themselves. As you nibble on a piece of dense rye bread, you realize that these humble grains, cultivated with sweat and skill, were the unsung heroes of medieval hunger. Without them, the rhythm of peasant life would have faltered long ago. You find yourself near a medieval village, well the lifeblood of daily existence and a crucial, if overlooked, player in peasant survival. Water, often taken for granted today, was a treasure then essential for cooking, drinking, and tending crops. But it wasn't always clean or easy to access, especially in the thick of winter or during droughts. Imagine lowering a wooden bucket, hearing the splash as it hits the water below, and hoisting it up, muscles straining from the weight. Wells were carefully maintained, often communal, and sometimes the subject of fierce local pride and dispute. Historians still argue whether some communities had more advanced water management systems than others, but everyone agreed on the importance of fresh water for survival. You might be surprised to learn that some peasants brewed weak ale or watered-down beer precisely because it was safer than drinking untreated water. Brewing acted as a crude purification method, boiling the water, fermenting it, just enough to kill off harmful microbes. So in a sense, the ale you imagined in the last section was also a safety measure against waterborne illnesses. There were also various folk remedies to cleanse water, from straining it through cloth to adding crushed herbs or charcoal. Some even believed that letting water sit overnight would magically settle the bad stuff, though scientists today might chuckle at that idea. Wells themselves were sometimes lined with stones or wooden planks, and in wealthier villages you'd find simple pulley systems to make bucket raising easier. It's a quiet, hard-working kind of technology, one that saved countless lives by ensuring reliable access to water. You might smile at the thought that wells were also social hubs. Early mornings and late afternoons found villagers gathering around, exchanging news or jokes, a moment of reprieve before heading back to the relentless demands of peasant life. Without these humble wells, pottage pots would never bubble bread dough, never rise, and thirst would gnaw away at even the strongest workers. They were quite literally the wellspring of survival. You trudge alongside a muddy path toward the village, common where livestock graze and cluck and snuffle, a living pantry for medieval peasants. Animals weren't just companions, they were essential providers of food labor and fertilizer. Cows, pigs, chickens, and sometimes even goats made the difference between scraping by and outright starvation. Think of the pig, a peculiar but versatile creature. Peasants loved pigs because they could be fed scraps and foraged leftovers, turning what humans couldn't eat into valuable meat and fat. There's a quirky side to pig husbandry. Some peasants, reportedly, let their pigs roam wild in forests or fields, even letting them root through garbage heaps. The forest pigs were hardy and low maintenance, although less predictable when it came to fattening up for winter. Cows provided milk, a staple for cheese and butter caloric powerhouses in a diet otherwise light on fat. You might not expect medieval peasants to drink much fresh milk, as many were lactose intolerant, but cheese was a brilliant way to preserve those nutrients. Historians still argue how widespread dairy farming was among peasants, depending on the region and the season. Chickens offered eggs and meat, plus a useful side benefit: pest control. You can almost hear the chickens scratching through leaf litter, gobbling up insects that would otherwise harm crops. Sometimes peasants even used chickens as alarm clocks, their crowing a reliable if noisy way to start the day. An odd but practical tactic involved using animal manure as fertilizer. Smelly, yes, but it kept the soil fertile for next year's crops. Villagers developed intricate systems of night soil collection and composting, recycling nature's waste into life-giving earth. Imagine the scent of fresh manure mingling with the sharp bite of morning air. Not exactly a spa day, but effective. The bond between peasants and their animals was complicated. They depended on them, cared for them, and sometimes mourned their loss. Food security often hinged on the health of these creatures, weaving their lives inseparably with human survival. You shuffle through the damp earth of a humble medieval garden, plot a small patch of cultivated hope, nestled against the edge of a thatched roof cottage. For peasants, these gardens were more than just decorative. They were vital sources of vitamins and flavor in a diet otherwise heavy on grains and stews. Imagine rows of hardy vegetables, onions, leeks, cabbages, and root crops like parsnips and carrots. These plants thrived in cooler seasons, offering much-needed freshness and nutrition. Herbs were grown too: parsley, sage, and mint to brighten meals and, amusingly, to mask the sometimes not-so-pleasant flavors of preserved or stale food. One quirky practice was the use of companion planting, where certain plants were grown together to naturally deter pests or improve soil health. For example, peas and beans could fix nitrogen in the soil, feeding the next crop silently underground. Historians still debate how widespread this technique was among peasants, but there's evidence suggesting an intuitive understanding of ecological balance. Gardens also served a medicinal purpose. You might stumble upon a small patch of comfrey or chamomile plants used for poultices or calming teas. The garden was a pharmacy in miniature, tended with as much care as the food crops. Watering was a laborious task, often done by hand, with buckets hauled from the well. This daily ritual connected peasants intimately to their land and their plants, a slow rhythm of nurture and patience. And when famine threatened, these gardens sometimes became crucial fallback food sources, stretching limited supplies just a bit further. The small successes of each growing season felt like tiny victories against hunger's relentless advance. The garden was a quiet testimony to resilience, fragile yet stubborn, much like the peasants themselves. You pull on worn leather gloves and head to the edge of the forest where wild foods grow untamed and free, offering peasants an essential supplement when cultivated crops failed or were scarce. Foraging was a skill, a small adventure that brought variety and hope to a diet too often dominated by bland staples. Picture yourself gathering wild berries, nuts, mushrooms, and edible roots, each with its own risk and reward. Some berries were sweet and nourishing, while others could cause upset stomachs if you weren't careful. Mushroom foraging was a gamble. Mistaken identity could lead to unpleasant, if not fatal, consequences. Historians still argue how much medieval peasants relied on foraging versus farming, but it's clear that this knowledge was passed down carefully from generation to generation. Folk traditions abounded about safe wild foods. Some peasants believed that wearing a particular herb or carrying a charm could protect against poisonous plants, blending practical survival with a touch of superstition. You might even chuckle at the thought that in some villages the best foragers were known as herb witches or wise women, respected for their knowledge, but sometimes feared. Seasonality played a huge role. In late summer and early autumn, nuts like hazelnuts or acorns were collected and stored, offering concentrated energy for the cold months ahead. Wild garlic and ramps added pungent zest to dishes, while dandelion greens and sorrel offered springtime bitterness to cleanse winter's heavy palate. Foraging wasn't just a solo affair, it was communal. Groups of villagers, sometimes whole families, would set out early to gather enough wild foods for markets or winter stores. The rhythm of foraging tied peasants deeply to the land's natural cycles, a subtle balance between respect and necessity. Wild food was a quiet savior, often overlooked, but essential in keeping hunger at bay. You settled down by the hearth, the flickering fire casting soft shadows on the walls as the village hums quietly outside. Preserving food was a constant challenge. Without modern refrigeration, medieval peasants had to rely on ancient techniques to stretch their meager supplies through harsh winters and lean times. Salting and smoking were among the most common methods. Salt, though precious, was traded or sourced locally in some regions, and its power to draw moisture out of meat and fish was a life-saving preservation trick. Picture racks of fish or strips of pork hanging in smokehouses, their scent both comforting and slightly acrid. Drying was another favorite tactic. Grains, herbs, mushrooms, and fruits were sun-dried or smoked over low heat, turning perishable food into long-lasting rations. You can almost feel the sun's warmth drying peasants' carefully strung garlands of herbs or the crunch of dried apples stored in barrels. Fermentation was less common, but still practiced especially in certain areas where sourdough bread or pickled vegetables added needed acidity and nutrients to the diet. Some peasants brewed ale or cider, creating mild alcohols that could be safer than questionable water sources. Historians still argue whether these drinks were everyday staples or occasional treats. Oddly enough, honey was one of the few natural sweeteners available, prized not just for its taste, but for its preservative and medicinal properties. Imagine the sticky hands of children stealing honeycomb, while parents kept it guarded for more practical uses. The art of preservation was an essential skill passed down carefully, a delicate balance of patience and knowledge. Each preserved morsel was a tiny victory, a promise against the hunger that crept with the changing seasons. You trudge through the muddy village market where the air buzzes with the chatter of peasants bartering small bundles of produce, hand-woven cloth, or homemade cheese. Trade and barter were lifelines for medieval peasants, allowing them to diversify their diets and acquire rare or seasonal goods that their own lands couldn't provide. Picture crates of salted herring arriving from coastal towns, exotic spices from far-off lands carried along the silk routes, or simple coarse bread exchanged for fresh milk or eggs. Markets were not just centers of commerce, but social hubs where news traveled and friendships formed. Sometimes peasants traded surplus crops, hand-me-down tools, or services like millwork or weaving. The complexity of barter systems varied by region, but was often based on mutual trust and necessity rather than formal currency. Historians still debate how much medieval peasants relied on coin versus barter in their everyday lives. You might be amused to learn that in some villages, peasants used unusual trade goods as currency, like salt blocks, which were so valuable that they sometimes served as payment for rent or taxes. Another quirky tidbit: some markets had odd taste tests to ensure the freshness of goods, such as licking a bit of cheese or smelling fish to avoid spoilage. Trade was a subtle dance of supply and demand, shaped by seasons, geography, and local customs. It offered peasants a window beyond their fields and hearths, a small but meaningful escape from monotony. You find yourself at dawn on the village green, watching as neighbors gather for communal meals during festivals and seasonal celebrations. Sharing food was more than survival, it was community glue, a moment of warmth and laughter in otherwise hard lives. Feasts were rare and modest, by modern standards, often centered around a simple dish like pottage, a thick stew of grains, vegetables, and sometimes scraps of meat. Imagine dipping your wooden spoon into the bubbling pot, savoring the familiar flavors, while stories and jokes circulate around the fire. You might find it amusing that medieval peasants sometimes added unusual ingredients like crushed bones or ground acorns to stretch the pottage further. And during these gatherings, music and dancing often accompanied the meals, turning necessity into festivity. Historians still argue whether such communal meals happened regularly or were limited to special occasions, but their social importance is undeniable. These moments offered a break from the daily grind and reinforced bonds that helped everyone endure lean times. Interestingly, some villages had commons where livestock grazed collectively, and occasionally the community shared the harvest or hunting spoils. This collective sharing underscored the fragile interdependence of peasant life. So, while hunger was a constant threat, the simple act of breaking bread together created a small, precious sanctuary where survival met celebration. You step quietly into the dimly lit cottage kitchen, where the scent of rye bread baking in the clay oven mingles with smoky herbs drying overhead. Bread was the foundation of the medieval peasant diet, and mastering its making was a daily ritual of patience and skill. Most peasants baked coarse, dense loaves of rye or barley bread, far from the fluffy white breads we enjoy today. Imagine the rough texture between your teeth, earthy, and filling sometimes flavored with bits of herbs or bits of leftover grains. Bread not only fed the body, but also held cultural significance. Breaking bread was a symbol of trust and community. Oddly enough, bread was sometimes used as a measuring tool for social status or food portions, with poorer peasants receiving thinner slices or black bread, denser and less refined. You might smile to learn that in some regions, bread money was even a form of payment or rent. Historians still argue how widespread different types of bread were and how exactly peasants balanced their grain supply between bread pottage and seed for the next planting. This balance was a daily concern. Overbaking meant less seed for future crops, risking next year's hunger. A quirky tidbit: in certain areas, peasants believed stale bread had healing powers, using it in poultices or rituals. This practical magic was a reminder that food was intertwined with health belief and survival. So, as you imagine, the daily bread baking picture. Hands working dough with care, knowing this humble loaf was a cornerstone of medieval life. You watch the village well, a center of daily life, where peasants gather not just for water, but also for gossip advice and occasional barter. Water sources were precious and precarious, and access to clean water played a subtle but crucial role in medieval peasants' fight against hunger and disease. Fetching water was often a woman's task, carried in heavy clay pots balanced on the hip or head. Imagine the rhythmic splash and clink as you fill your jug, mindful of conserving each precious drop. Wells and springs could easily become contaminated, leading to outbreaks of illness that would weaken the community and reduce food productivity. Interestingly, some peasants practiced primitive water filtration using sand charcoal or woven cloth to improve water quality, a folk science that historians find fascinating. Others believed that water from certain springs held healing or protective powers, a blend of practical and mystical approaches to survival. Historians still argue how widespread and effective these water management practices were, but the consensus is clear. Water scarcity and quality shaped daily routines and health outcomes in profound ways. A quirky note: in some regions, villagers marked certain wells as women's wells or men's wells, thought to have different properties or social roles. And occasionally, communal celebrations revolved around the blessing of water sources, showing how vital and revered this resource was. So, as you imagine, the village, well, picture a small world of shared effort, superstition, and survival, swirling around that simple pool of water. You sit by the fire as the evening hushes the village, the smell of smoldering wood mingling with the faint aroma of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Hunger is a quiet companion, but medieval peasants fought it not only with food, but with medicine and tradition, blending the practical with the mystical to soothe stomachs and spirits alike. Herbal remedies were common, with nettle tea, fennel, and dandelion used to aid digestion and improve appetite. Imagine sipping a bitter brew that's more comforting in intention than taste, a ritual passed down through generations. These folk medicines sometimes doubled as food supplements, offering vitamins or calming properties. You might chuckle to learn that some remedies included ingredients like crushed snail shells for calcium or ashes, believed to cleanse the body. Historians still debate the efficacy of many such treatments, but their cultural significance is undeniable. Beyond herbs, peasants relied on ritual and prayer to ward off hunger's shadow. Blessings over seed offerings to land spirits and communal fasting for good harvests formed a tapestry of belief woven tightly into daily life. As you drift deeper into the village night, remember that overcoming hunger was as much a mental and spiritual battle as a physical one, where hope, tradition, and tiny comforts helped carry the weary through. You awake with the soft glow of dawn spilling through your thatched window, the world stirring to the slow rhythm of medieval village life. As a peasant, your morning begins with the humble task of tending to root cellars and food storage, crucial for surviving the unpredictable seasons and the dreaded lean months. Imagine yourself opening a cool, earthy root cellar, the smell of damp soil, and stored vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions filling your senses. These cellars were vital for preserving food through winter, keeping perishables fresh longer by using the natural chill and darkness underground. Interestingly, some peasants cleverly layered their root crops with straw or sand to protect them from freezing, a simple yet effective technique passed orally. You might find it surprising that historians still debate the extent of root cellar usage across different regions, suggesting some villages had better preservation methods than others. Oddly enough, in certain areas, peasants stored dried mushrooms or wild herbs alongside roots to enhance their diet's flavor and nutrition when fresh produce was scarce. And the ingenuity didn't stop there. Some experimented with burying salted meat or fish, extending their edible lifespan. This quiet act of tending your underground larder each morning was a small but critical victory in the ongoing battle against hunger, a daily ritual that connected you to the land and the cycles of survival. You step out into the early sunlight where the field work begins in earnest. The rhythm of sowing and harvesting dictated every aspect of peasant life, with hunger often lurking when crops failed or the seasons turned harsh unexpectedly. Imagine yourself wielding a simple wooden plow, guiding it through furrows of dark soil. The choice of crops, barley, rye, oats, and legumes, was shaped by climate and tradition, each offering different yields and nutritional benefits. Peasants depended heavily on grains, but also on pulses like peas and beans to fill the gaps in their diet. Quirky though it sounds, some peasants believed talking to their seeds or singing to the fields could improve crop yields, a charming blend of superstition and hope. Historians still argue about how widespread these rituals were, but the emotional comfort they provided is unquestionable. One intriguing practice involved intercropping, planting fast-growing vegetables alongside slower grains to maximize space and harvest variety. This early form of sustainable farming showcased peasant ingenuity in stretching every square foot of arable land. As you feel the soil crumble between your fingers, you understand the deep bond between peasants and their fields, a connection fueled by necessity, tradition, and a quiet resilience against the ever-present threat of hunger. You find yourself at the village market, a bustling yet strangely gentle swirl of bartering and neighborly chatter. For medieval peasants, markets were not just places to sell surplus goods, they were vital hubs for supplementing a diet often limited to what their land could produce. Picture yourself carrying a basket of eggs or a few woven baskets of wild berries, eyeing the stalls where salted fish, cheese, and coarse bread are traded. Trading was a delicate dance. You might barter a week's worth of eggs for a chunk of smoked meat or some dried fruit luxuries that could stave off hunger's harsh edge. An unexpected detail in some villages, peasants exchanged not only goods, but also stories and recipes, turning markets into centers of cultural exchange. Historians still debate how accessible markets were to the poorest peasants, with some evidence suggesting barriers like fees or social status limited participation. One odd but true fact is that market days sometimes coincided with religious festivals, blending commerce and celebration in a way that softened the daily grind. The air would fill with the scent of herbs, the clatter of wooden carts, and the murmur of deals struck. In these moments, you sense how medieval peasants cleverly stretched their resources, weaving community and commerce into their ongoing struggle to keep hunger at bay. The afternoon sun warms the dirt floor of your humble cottage as you prepare a meal from what little you have gathered. Peasant cooking was a masterclass in making much out of little, using simple ingredients to create sustenance that could keep hunger's shadow at bay. Imagine a bubbling pot of pottage, a thick stew of grains, vegetables, and occasionally bits of salted meat or dried fish. This staple dish was the backbone of most peasants' diets, simmered slowly over an open hearth to extract every bit of flavor and nourishment. You might smile, knowing that in some regions peasants even included acorns or chestnuts in their stews when other foods ran scarce, a creative nod to survival. Historians still argue whether these wild ingredients were a matter of necessity or a culinary preference. The cooking techniques were basic but effective: boiling, roasting on spits, or baking on flat stones. Preservation methods like drying or salting helped stretch out limited supplies. And the humble bread, often coarse and dense, was sometimes enriched with herbs or wild greens to add a touch of life to the meal. This quiet moment, stirring the pot and smelling the mingling aromas, encapsulates the resilience of medieval peasants who turned whatever they had into comfort and sustenance. As the day winds down, you join neighbors gathered around a modest fire, sharing stories and the small pleasures that made peasant life bearable. Evenings were times to reconnect, exchange news, and find warmth in community, crucial when food was sometimes scarce. You might overhear tales of strange remedies for hunger's pangs, like chewing on certain roots or drinking herbal infusions to quell the empty feeling. Some peasants swore by these folk cures, while others treated them as little more than superstition. Historians still argue whether these practices had any real effect or were simply psychological comforts passed down through generations. What's certain is that the ritual of gathering and sharing gave a sense of belonging and hope. Occasionally, a traveling storyteller or musician would arrive, offering brief escapes into myth and music, distracting minds from the grumble of empty stomachs. Imagine the flickering firelight dancing on faces as laughter and quiet jokes ripple through the crowd. In these gentle moments, hunger was not just a physical sensation, but a shared experience softened by companionship and the simple human need to connect. Night falls softly over the village, and you retreat to your humble bed, the weariness of the day wrapping around you like a thick woolen cloak. Sleep was both a refuge and a challenge for medieval peasants, especially when hunger gnawed quietly beneath the covers. You pull your coarse blanket tighter, perhaps recalling the herbal sachets tucked beneath your pillow, lavender mugwort, or valerian, used to soothe restless minds and encourage gentle dreams. These natural aids were prized in peasant households, passed down like treasured secrets. Interestingly, some peasants believed that the direction of their bed or the shape of their home could influence sleep quality and hunger dreams, a curious blend of folklore and daily reality. Historians still debate how seriously these beliefs affected actual sleep practices. Despite the hardships, sleep was a vital time for the body to rest and rebuild. It's worth noting that some peasants timed their day to rest during the hottest afternoon hours, a sort of siesta, to conserve energy when food was scarce. As your eyelids grow heavy, remember that even in the simplest moments, medieval peasants found ways to nurture their bodies and spirits, weaving rest and resilience together to face another day. Morning light seeps through the cracks in your cottage walls as you rise once again to greet the day, determined to find new ways to outsmart hunger. For medieval peasants, each dawn was a fresh challenge and opportunity to sustain their families. Today you decide to head out to gather wild plants and herbs, a practice that added variety and nutrition to your daily meals. Think nettles, dandelions, or wild garlic flavors and vitamins from nature's pantry that supplemented staple crops. You might chuckle, knowing that some plants were so common they were considered weeds by farmers, yet they were culinary treasures to peasants. Historians still debate whether gathering wild greens was a necessity born from poverty or a tradition of connection with the land. Along the way, you keep an eye out for edible mushrooms or berries, though caution is key. One wrong choice could lead to a very bad day indeed. Folklore was your guide here, passed down by elders like bedtime stories with a survival twist. The morning air is crisp, and your basket slowly fills with nature's gifts, small tokens of hope and sustenance in an often uncertain world. With your basket full of wild greens, you return to the hearth to transform these humble ingredients into a nourishing meal. Peasant kitchens might be simple, but they were stages for resourcefulness and flavor in equal measure. Imagine chopping nettles carefully. Don't forget the gloves, or your hands will sting for days, and adding them to a bubbling pot of barley pottage. The slight bitterness of the greens balanced the earthy grains, creating a dish that was both filling and familiar. In some regions, you'd sprinkle in wild herbs like lovage or savory, turning the meal into a subtle symphony of tastes. Some peasants even picked up these herbs as natural remedies, blending cooking and healing into one. Interestingly, historians still debate how much variety was truly available to peasants and how much was seasonal luck versus learned knowledge. What's undeniable is that every ingredient had a story and a purpose. As the aroma rises from the hearth, you feel a quiet pride. This simple stew is more than food. It's a testament to survival ingenuity and the slow rhythm of medieval life. With the midday meal behind you, the afternoon stretches ahead, often spent balancing chores and moments of rest. You decide to tend to your small vegetable patch, a precious luxury for many peasants who depended heavily on what they could grow themselves. Your plot might contain hardy crops like onions, leeks, or cabbages, slow growers that store well and provide steady nutrition through lean months. Watching these plants grow was a small daily joy, a tangible sign of your efforts taking root. Some peasants practiced crop rotation or companion planting, ancient techniques to keep the soil fertile and pests at bay. Historians still argue how widespread and sophisticated these methods were among the lower classes, but evidence suggests knowledge was shared through generations. You pause to examine a row of beans climbing a stake, appreciating their quiet tenacity. This simple task feels meditative, a contrast to the harshness of hunger, reminding you that growth, like hope, takes time. By caring for your garden, you invest in the future, softening the uncertainty of the medieval peasant's life with steady, patient work. As the afternoon light begins to fade, you turn your attention to the animals that might share your small farmstead. Chickens scratching for insects, a goat nibbling leaves, or perhaps a few pigs rooting in the mud, all modest sources of sustenance and income. You crack a wry smile, recalling how some peasants had to be inventive, feeding their animals kitchen scraps or leftover grains to keep them alive through winter. It was a delicate balancing act, preserving food for your family while nurturing these living larders. Interestingly, historians still debate how widespread animal husbandry really was among the poorest peasants, with some evidence suggesting many relied solely on seasonal hunting or wild foraging. Feeding and caring for animals demanded daily attention and patience, and it provided eggs, milk, or meat in small but vital amounts. These tiny provisions were lifelines, making the difference between hunger and survival. As dusk settles, the sounds of your animals settling down echo softly, a comforting soundtrack to the end of another demanding day. Evening brings a much-needed pause, and you gather with your family around the hearth to share what the day has provided. The glow of the fire casts warm shadows on the wooden walls, wrapping you in a cocoon of quiet comfort. Tonight's supper might be a modest loaf of rye bread, perhaps shared with a splash of sour milk or a handful of cheese, simple, humble, but deeply satisfying after the day's labor. You might chuckle, remembering tales of peasants who considered a good crust of stale bread a delicacy, especially when paired with a drizzle of honey, a rare but treasured treat. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants had much access to such luxuries or if these stories are romanticized nostalgia. Either way, these little indulgences marked moments of joy amid hardship. The evening meal is more than sustenance. It's a ritual of togetherness, a quiet celebration of what you've managed to gather and grow, a gentle reassurance against the ever-present shadow of hunger. After dinner, your family settles into the dimly lit cottage, the flickering firelight blending with the soft chorus of night sounds outside. This quiet time is precious a chance to rest your body and mind. You might listen to stories told by elders' legends spun with just enough humor to keep your spirits light or hum old songs learned from neighbors. These moments knit the community tight, a social fabric as important as any crop or harvest. You may even find yourself chuckling at the local belief that hanging garlic by the door keeps not only spirits away, but also bad hunger, luck folklore, and food intertwined in delightful ways. Historians still debate how much peasant culture varied regionally. But one thing's clear, storytelling was a gentle balm, a shared way to endure and find meaning in daily struggles. The comforting routine of evening stories and songs settles over you like a soft blanket, preparing you for the deep rest ahead. As the fire burns low, you prepare your sleeping area, a simple pallet of straw laid carefully on the earthen floor. The scent of dry hay mingles with the faint smoke from the hearth, grounding you in this humble space. You might arrange a small bundle of herbs nearby, lavender, rosemary, or thyme, not just for fragrance, but for their believed calming properties, a medieval version of today's aromatherapy. A quirky fact you might appreciate: some peasants believed that placing a knife under their pillow could ward off bad dreams, though historians still argue whether this was widespread or a localized superstition. You settle down, feeling the cool night air seep through the cracks in the walls, but also the reassuring warmth from the day's fire embers. Your body, tired but soothed, begins to slow. The rhythmic chirping of crickets outside and the distant hoot of an owl become a lullaby as you drift closer to sleep, comforted by the routines that kept hunger at bay and hope alive. You slowly sink into the softness of your straw mattress, the fatigue of the day pressing down like a gentle weight. Outside, the moon casts a pale glow, and you imagine the sprawling fields you've tended resting now beneath the silver light. Even as you close your eyes, your mind drifts to the rhythms of the seasons, the planting, the harvest, the lean times in between. and the quiet ingenuity that kept your ancestors nourished through it all. There's a subtle humor in how medieval peasants relied on what we might now see as humble tricks, turning weeds into meals, preserving food with ash or smoke, or sharing stories to keep spirits fed when stomachs were empty. Historians still argue about how much these customs varied between regions, but one thing remains certain: resilience was baked into the daily life, as essential as the bread itself. The peaceful darkness welcomes you, a soft invitation to rest, while the echoes of the day's labors fade into the gentle night. Before sleep fully claims you, a final thought lingers: how much the medieval peasant life was a delicate dance between scarcity and plenty, hardship and small joys. You've journeyed through fields, kitchens, and humble homes, exploring the resourcefulness that turned simple ingredients into survival and daily rituals into resilience. There's something quietly inspiring in the way these people managed to face hunger, not with despair, but with steady hands and hopeful hearts, adapting ancient knowledge and passing it on through generations. As your breathing slows, the stories and scenes you've wandered through begin to blur gently, like a soft watercolor fading into night. Remember, in this vast and complex history, each small act of endurance, each modest meal, was a triumph against the odds. Now, let your thoughts drift softly away like a leaf on a slow river, carrying you deeper into peaceful rest. The night is calm now. Your body relaxes, sinking into the quiet warmth of your bed. The worries of the day dissolve into the soft shadows around you, and a gentle peace settles over your mind. Imagine the last flicker of candlelight, fading the comforting sounds of the countryside, humming a lullaby, and the slow rhythm of your heartbeat, syncing with the ancient pulse of the earth. You've traveled far in time tonight, walked among fields tilled by hands long gone, and felt the quiet courage of lives lived simply but fully. Let that calmness wash over you, a soothing balm for the soul. Good night, dear friend. Sleep well.